good evening, everybody. Looks like we've got a little over 200 people in the room. Tonight's webinar is actually a webinar based on a pair of columns that I wrote for Sport Aviation that appeared in the January and February 2011 issues of the magazine. I'm Mike Bush, and Hal has gone over a lot of biographical stuff, but I guess probably the most important biographical stuff for this webinar is the fact that I've been an aircraft owner for something over 4 decades, and have had a pretty sensational history of engine longevity. My current airplane that I fly and maintain is a Cessna Turbo 310, a turbocharged piston twin that I've owned for about 25 years. And both engines on that airplane are at 200% of TBO now and doing just fine, thank you very much. And about 2/3 of the cylinders on those 2 engines, about 8 out of the 12 cylinders, are the original 1979 cylinders that went on the airplane when it was brand new, and have about 4,600 or 4,700 hours, I forget, on those cylinders. So I've had some pretty spectacular luck with engine longevity, and there are a lot of factors that contribute to that, but oil is a key component. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about tonight on the subject of engine oil. We'll be talking about the various types of oil available, monograde versus multigrade, mineral, petroleum-based oil versus synthetic oils. We'll be talking a little about aftermarket additives, talking about oil consumption and how much oil consumption is too much and what it all means, a little bit about oil levels and what oil level we should be operating these engines at, oil change intervals, oil filter inspections, and a little bit about spectrographic oil analysis. So let's proceed, and we'll start talking about the major functions of engine oil in our piston aircraft engines. If you ask most people what the function of engine oil is, they would say probably to provide lubrication, prevent metal-to-metal contact between moving parts in the engine. And that's certainly an important function of oil, but it's only one of 6 functions, and arguably in piston aircraft engines, lubrication may not even be the most important function of engine oil. Engine oil also provides a very important cooling function. We think of our engines, most of them, as air-cooled engines, but only certain parts of the engine, like cylinder heads, receive air cooling. And there are a lot of components, some of which run at extremely high temperatures, let's say pistons, for example, that get no air cooling at all. They don't have fins, they don't have cool air moving over them. In fact, the only way pistons get cooled at all is because we splash copious amounts of oil on the bottom of them, and that transfers heat from the piston to the oil, which is a good thing because otherwise the pistons would melt. After all, they're made out of aluminum and they don't have a very high melting point. And of course, doing that heats up the oil, and then we pass the oil through an oil cooler and transfer that heat to the air, which is passing through the oil cooler. Another very, very important function of our engine oil is to clean the engine. And in piston aircraft engines, that's a much more important function than it is, say, in automotive engines, because our aircraft engines are literally filthy beasts that have much, much higher amounts of blow-by and put a lot more combustion byproducts into the inside of the engine. We run them on leaded gas, and so there are a lot of nasty lead deposits that we aren't dealing with in our automotive engines, but we are dealing with in aircraft engines. And one of engine oil's key functions, and a particularly important function for piston aircraft engines, is to keep all of that nasty, filthy stuff in suspension, not allow it to sludge up and dirty up the inside of our engines, and allow most of it to be filtered out by the oil filter, and the rest of it kept in suspension and drained out when we change the engine oil, which we do much more frequently on piston aircraft engines than we do on car engines. Another function of the oil is to act as a sealant to prevent leakage of gases and other liquids past O-rings and gaskets and the ring pack seal on our pistons and various other places where we don't crankcase half parting seams, places where we don't want leakage to occur. The oil acts as an actuator in many of our engines. If you have a controllable pitch prop, the hydraulic fluid that controls the pitch of the prop is normally engine oil. If you have a turbocharged engine, the hydraulic fluid that operates the wastegate is typically engine oil. And finally, and this is another extremely important function of engine oil in our piston aircraft engines, piston aircraft engines spend a lot more time not running than automotive engines. We don't fly our airplanes as often or as regularly as we drive our cars. At least most of us don't. And so the engine sits unused for relatively long periods of time, and the only thing that protects the engine against corrosion, particularly the exposed ferrous metal components of the engine, like cam lobes and lifter faces and cylinder bores and so on, is a protective film of oil. So it's particularly important in our piston aircraft engines to use an oil that has excellent corrosion protective properties and has a long-lasting film to protect those components. So let's start with the lubrication part. And the purpose of lubrication is to minimize friction and wear. The science of friction and wear is something called tribology, and I actually wrote a column in Sport Aviation on the subject of tribology. But basically, tribology is the science of friction and wear, and friction is the resistance to movement of moving parts that are in contact with one another. Most of those parts that we deal with are metals of various kinds. The reason that friction occurs is that although moving surfaces in our engines and other mechanisms tend to look smooth to the naked eye, if you look at an electron microscope photograph, the surfaces are very, very rough at the molecular level, and they have lots of peaks and valleys. And when two metal surfaces are in contact with one another, the peaks tend to adhere to one another by means of what are called micro welds. When we have metal parts in contact with one another that are moving relative to one another, those micro welds are constantly being sheared and reforming, and it's the process of shearing and reforming micro welds that is what we know as friction. And the material that is lost as these micro welds shear and reform is what we call wear. If you take your hands and your palms and rub them vigorously against one another, you'll feel heat. And believe it or not, what you're doing when you rub your hands against one another is you're creating and breaking millions of little micro welds, and the heat that you feel is due to the shearing of those micro welds. These are very, very tiny. They occur at the molecular level. You can't see them by the naked eye, or even with a powerful magnifying glass. You'd have to have a scanning electron microscope view to actually see this stuff occur. But that's what causes this friction. Now, lubrication is how we minimize friction, and it's done in one of two ways, or some combination of those two ways. When we have parts that are moving relatively rapidly with respect to one another, let's imagine a piston reciprocating inside a cylinder, and there's compression rings on that piston that are moving rapidly with respect to the cylinder wall. The way we control friction is via something called hydrodynamic lubrication. Hydrodynamic lubrication occurs where we interpose something between the moving parts, usually some sort of a liquid, although not always, that keeps them physically separated. And when we put a lubricant like oil between two rapidly moving surfaces, the movement of those surfaces generates pressure in the liquid, and that pressure is what keeps the parts mechanically separated, and as long as they're mechanically separated, they can't be creating these micro welds. The best mental picture of that is to think about a water skier being towed across the surface of a lake, and as long as the speed of the water skier is high enough, and or the weight of the water skier is low enough, the pressure generated by his motion over the surface of the lake will keep him from sinking and contacting the bottom of the lake. So that's how hydrodynamic lubrication works, and it works best when we have parts that have a relatively low load forcing them together and relatively high speed motion of the parts relative to one another, because it's the motion that creates the pressure in the lubricant that keeps the parts separated and reduces or eliminates friction. The other extreme is where we have parts where the relative speed between them is low. And if the relative speed is low, then hydrodynamic lubrication typically won't work. I mean, think about that same water skier where the boat slows down, and when the water skier's speed gets low enough, he's going to start sinking into the lake, and that's exactly what happens when we're talking about lubrication. Think about the piston when it reaches, say, top dead center, and it gradually slows to a stop and then reverses direction. And during that period where it's slowing to a stop and reversing direction, hydrodynamic lubrication breaks down. That's why when you look in a cylinder that's been in use for some time, the most obvious wear occurs at what we call the ring step area, or the ring reversal area, where the compression rings slow to a stop and reverse direction. And hydrodynamic lubrication, which is what normally keeps the rings and the cylinder wall apart, stops working because the relative motion is too low for it to work. When we have cases where we have low speed of the moving parts with respect to one another, then we have to rely on something called boundary lubrication. Boundary lubrication is a chemical phenomenon where instead of actually keeping the parts separated, which is what hydrodynamic lubrication does, we use various chemicals that have the property of inhibiting the formation of microwelds. Boundary lubrication is never as effective as hydrodynamic lubrication, but if we don't have enough relative motion between the parts, that's what we have to rely on. And then there are various cases where we have a little bit of motion between the parts, but not quite enough, where we rely on a mixture of boundary lubrication and hydrodynamic lubrication. Again, if we go back to the example of you rubbing your hands together and generating friction, there are two ways that you could reduce that friction, and you'd feel it in the form of reduced heat when you rub your palms together. One way would be to coat your hands with dish soap or oil, and so that they're slippery, and you'd rub them together and you'd feel a lot less heat and a lot less friction, and that's hydrodynamic lubrication. Another way you could do it is to sprinkle talcum powder or graphite on your hands, and the talcum powder it provides boundary layer lubrication, and it doesn't actually keep the palms apart, but it inhibits the formation of microwelds, and again your hands will rub together with less resistance and generate less heat. So those are kind of examples you can use to help visualize these two kinds, basic kinds of lubrication. So hydrodynamic lubrication is affected by interposing a lubricant, normally a fluid, between two solids in relative motion. And we have two basic kinds of hydrodynamic lubrication that we use in piston aircraft engines. One is called pressure lubrication, where we're actually pumping the lubricant into the boundary between the two moving parts. And the most common example of pressure lubrication is bearings, where there are actually oil galleries and passages that transfer the oil under pressure directly into the bearing between the bearing surfaces, and provide hydrodynamic lubrication. But most of the engine does not have pressure lubrication. For example, the interface between the cam and lifters, the interface between the rings and the cylinder walls, there's no pressure, there's no oil under pressure being applied to those surfaces. The way those surfaces get hydrodynamic lubrication is by what's called splash lubrication, where large quantities of oil in the form of a mist is directed against those surfaces and provides the lubricant. For example, cylinder walls are lubricated because large quantities of oil are extruded out the main crankshaft bearings and the large rod end bearings, and because the crankshaft is spinning at a high speed, the oil that's extruded out of those bearings gets flung in every direction in the form of a very dense oil mist. And a good part of that oil mist winds up hitting the bottom of the piston, which accomplishes two things. One is it cools the piston, and the other is it goes through little holes in the piston to the oil control ring, which applies a coating of fresh oil to the cylinder walls every time the piston goes up and down. So that's how lubrication gets to the cylinder walls. It's not, doesn't get there under pressure. It gets there by splash. And once again, the same thing is true of the one of the other real critical interfaces in the engine, the cam and lifter interface, which again has no pressure lubrication. It's lubricated by splash oil. The second kind of lubrication, again, is boundary lubrication, which is not a liquid that separates the two surfaces, but it's a thin, soft, solid film of some sort typically provided by various additives in the engine oil, that prevents metal adhesion by inhibiting the formation of microwelds. Key areas in the engine that rely mostly on boundary lubrication are, once again, the cylinder in the ring reversal area at top dead center and at bottom dead center, but particularly at top dead center because there's a lot more pressure at that point to provide some sort of lubrication between the compression rings and the cylinder wall at the point where the piston is slowing to a stop in reversing direction, and hydrodynamic lubrication just stops working. Another area where we rely on boundary lubrication is the valve guide, the valve stem to valve guide interface, particularly for exhaust valves, because we've got moving parts in there, the stem and the valve guide, that have essentially no hydrodynamic lubrication, both because they're not moving fast enough and because there's almost no liquid oil in the stem to guide interface, simply because it's so hot that liquid oil in there would coke and not be able to provide any kind of effective hydrodynamic lubrication. So we rely mainly on boundary lubrication provided by various oil additives to keep valve stem and valve guide wear to a minimum. The cam and lifter interface is kind of a mixed lubrication situation. There's very little pressure between the cam and lifter when the valves are closed, and so hydrodynamic lubrication is typically adequate. But at the critical point where the toe of the cam is lifting the lifter and opening the valve against very, very high forces of valve springs and high pressure in the cylinder, there's not adequate hydrodynamic lubrication, and so we have to rely on boundary lubrication for the cam and lifter interface at the area where there's the most force between the parts, specifically where the cam toe is lifting the lifter. Also, when we dry start the engine, that is, when the engine is started after it's sat around for quite a while and most of the oil film has stripped off the parts, that during the first few seconds after start, until an oil film is reestablished, we rely almost exclusively on boundary lubrication for that very first part of the start cycle. And in fact, we generate more wear in an engine during the first 15 or 20 seconds after we start it than we typically do for the rest of the run. Moving on to types of oil, we have both monograde and multigrade oils. These are this list of 6 oils is the most common. These are the most common oils used in the U.S. In the multigrade stack, the most common oil that's used today in the general aviation fleet, and actually the one that I dislike the most for reasons that I will tell you in a bit, is Aeroshell 15W50. It's a multigrade oil that is composed of about 50% synthetic stock, something called polyalpha olefin, which is a synthetic oil, about 50% mineral oil made from dead dinosaurs, and a bunch of additives, including viscosity index improvers that provide the multigrade characteristic. We'll talk about all of these in following slides. Exxon Elite is very similar to Aeroshell 15W50, except that Exxon Elite is only 25% synthetic and 75% petroleum stock. The third popular multigrade oil is Phillips XC20W50, and Phillips has no synthetics in it at all. It's made entirely of petroleum-based mineral oil with the usual set of, with a kind of a minimal set of additives, including VI improvers, which is what makes it multigrade. Monograde oil, let me mention on monograde oils, we have a very archaic and confusing nomenclature for the viscosity of monograde oils. Oil that's called 100 grade is SAE 50. So the 50 weight that is used in multigrade corresponds to 100 grade in monograde, and this is some weird old terminology that dates back to before World War II. I'm a little surprised we still use it. It would be a lot less confusing if we called our monograde oils 50 or 40 weight rather than 100 or 80 grade, but the terminology persists. Aeroshell 100 or 80 is an oil that is normally used as a break-in oil. It lacks almost all additives. It does not have the normal ashless dispersants that are normally added to operating oils to keep the engines clean and to inhibit sludge. We normally use this oil only for break-in, and we use it more out of tradition than anything else. I've never seen the slightest evidence that a non-AD oil like Aeroshell 100 or Aeroshell 80 accomplishes break-in any better than its operating ashless dispersant version, which has a W on the front of it. Aeroshell W100 and W80 are petroleum-based monograde oils with minimum additive components in them. Aeroshell W100 is what I use in my own airplane and what I recommend for quite a few of my clients. Aeroshell W100 Plus and W80 Plus, which are again the 50 and 40 weight versions of the oil, are the same as W100 or W80, but they have some additional additives, including anti-scuff additive called triphenyl phosphate and an anti-corrosion additive. Now let's talk a little bit about viscosity. Viscosity is the thickness of the oil, and monograde oils that are normally made of all petroleum oil, the viscosity varies considerably with oil temperature. They're relatively thin when the oil is hot at operating temperature. They get very thick when they cool to room temperature. And in fact, if it's real cold out, they get so thick that we can't develop oil pressure. So monograde oils vary quite dramatically. The viscosity of monograde oils vary quite dramatically with oil temperature. Thin when they're hot, thick when they're cool, very, very, very thick when they're cold. Multigrade oils also have viscosity that varies with oil temperature, but it varies a lot less. To make a multigrade oil, you normally start with a thin, non-viscous oil, typically something like SAE 10 or SAE 15 oil, and then you add a viscosity index improver, which is an additive. It's a man-made polymer that has very unusual property of getting thicker as it heats up rather than thinner. So the base oil thins out as it heats up. The VI improver gets more viscous and thicker as it heats up. And so by blending in the appropriate amount of VI improver, the oil manufacturer can make the viscosity curve, the viscosity versus temperature curve, pretty much anything he wants. Now keep in mind that VI improvers are not lubricants. They're thickeners. They're kind of like cornstarch in soup, except that they have this unique characteristic that they get thicker and thicker as the oil gets hotter and hotter. So at operating temperature, Aeroshell W100 and Aeroshell 15W50 both have basically the same viscosity. They're SAE 50 oils, both. But at room temperature, Aeroshell W100, the monograde, is very thick. It has the consistency of blackstrap molasses, whereas Aeroshell 15W50, the multigrade, is very thin at room temperature. It has the consistency of Aunt Jemima light, or I suppose you could use ketchup versus tomato juice if you prefer. Our oils, both the base stock and the VI improvers, are made of giant molecules. They're called polymers. Some of them, like the mineral oil, are natural. Others, like the PAO, the polyalpha olefin synthetic, that's used in semi-synthetic oils like Aeroshell 50W50 and Exxon Elite, are man-made. And the VI improvers, of course, are also man-made. These are very huge molecules, and their shape is very important. As you can see, the shape of mineral oil that's derived from petroleum has a very branchy structure to it. And the synthetic stock, polyalpha olefin, that's used in semi-synthetic oils like Aeroshell 15W50 and Exxon Elite are much smoother and don't have lots of little side branches. Viscosity index improvers are kind of a unique molecule that roll up in a little ball when they're cold, and unroll themselves when they warm up, which gives them that unique characteristic of thickening the oil as the oil heats up. Now, the shape of the mineral oil molecules and the PAO molecules are fairly significant. They explain a lot of the properties. Synthetic oil is slipperier because it doesn't have the side branches. Mineral oil, because it has the side branches, has two properties that synthetic oil doesn't have. One that's a positive, one that's a negative. The negative is that mineral oil, as it operates in service, has viscosity that gradually degrades because the little branches break off when the oil is in service as a lubricant between rapidly moving metal surfaces. So the longer you keep mineral oil in service, the more its viscosity degrades. That's not true of synthetics like PAO. And so, for example, in automotive use, synthetic oil can be left in service much longer, and the oil change interval can be extended because the synthetic oil doesn't degrade in viscosity as it remains in service. It can retain its viscosity characteristics for a very long time. The other characteristic about mineral oil versus synthetic is that mineral oil is much better at holding particulate material in suspension, again, because of its branchy nature. Its ability to do that degrades over time as it remains in service. But if we change the mineral oil fairly frequently, it does a pretty good job of keeping the engine clean, holding a particulate matter in suspension, that particulate matter that's too small to be caught by the oil filter, and allowing us to drain out the junk at oil change time, rather than having it settle out in the form of sludge on the inside of the engine. PAO doesn't do nearly as good a job of cleaning because, again, it's very, very slippery and it can't hang on to things very well. That's why we no longer have fully synthetic aircraft engine oils. The last fully synthetic aircraft engine oil that was on the market, which was Mobil Av1, was taken off the market in a hail of lawsuits because it ruined a lot of aircraft engines, particularly because it could not deal with the lead in the avgas, and there were a lot of engines that were ruined by lead sludge settling out of suspension. So there were a lot of lawsuits against Mobil. They pulled their Av1 full synthetic oil off the market back sometime in the 90s, and we don't have full synthetic oil anymore. We do have some semi-synthetic oils like Aeroshell 15W50 and Exxon Elite that have some polyalpha olefin in them. It's about 50-50 for Aeroshell 15W50. It's about 25% synthetic for Exxon Elite. But these oils all have generous amounts of mineral oil in them in order to keep the engines clean. This is not a problem that we have with automotive engines, and fully synthetic oils work really well in automotive engines other than diesels, which are pretty filthy, just like our aircraft engines are. And when the day comes that we are running our engines on unleaded avgas, then I think synthetic oils like polyalpha olefin will have to get another look. But for the moment, synthetic oils just don't do a good enough job of cleaning, particularly with respect to the lead deposits that form because we use heavily leaded avgas, and we need to use at least some mineral oil. So once again, advantages of synthetic oil over mineral oil is that it's slipperier, has better lubricity, and that it can last longer because the phenomenon of polymer shearing, which degrades the viscosity of mineral oil over time, is very, very much reduced with synthetic oil because it doesn't have that branchy structure. The advantages of mineral oil are that it does a much better job of holding particulate matter in suspension, so that we can drain it out at oil change time rather than having it form sludge inside the engine, and that's particularly true of lead sludge. And mineral oil, because of its branchy structure, seals a little better when we're dealing with things like gaskets and O-rings. Synthetic oil tends to sneak by those things a lot more, and so we see a lot more leaks in engines run on synthetic oil than we do on mineral oil. The important thing to understand is that while the benefits of synthetic oil are very, very significant in clean running engines like automotive engines and turbine aircraft engines, we really can't take much advantage of them with piston aircraft engines that are running on leaded avgas. We can't take advantage of the extended oil change intervals because our piston aircraft engines are so filthy and they put so much junk in the oil that even though the synthetic oil holds its viscosity just fine, we have to drain it on a regular basis just to get the junk out. Is not a problem that we have with automotive engines, or very much, and almost at all with turbine engines, which keep their oil very clean because they don't have this big dirty blow-by problem that we have in our piston aircraft engines. So most of the advantages of synthetic oil are ones that we can't really take advantage of in our piston aircraft engines. Also, the better lubricity of synthetic oil is much less important in our piston aircraft engines, simply because their lubrication demands are so very much lower than most other kinds of engines. Specifically, our piston aircraft engines are very, very slow turning. The clearances are very large, and we just don't. They don't have the kinds of lubrication demands that high revving automotive engines or very high revving turbine engines have. So again, the advantages of synthetic oil are compelling when we talk about turbine engines and automotive engines running on unleaded fuel. They aren't nearly as compelling when we talked about piston aircraft engines, and there are actually some significant disadvantages of synthetic oil, specifically that they don't keep our engines clean nearly as well as mineral oil does. With regard to multigrade versus monograde, the obvious advantage of a multigrade oil is that because it's thin at cold temperatures, we get oil pressure comes up faster, and we get a quicker hydrodynamic lubrication when we start the engine at cold outside air temperatures. But the advantage that multigrade has for cold starting is a disadvantage when it comes to corrosion protection. Because the multigrade oil is so thin at room temperature, it tends to strip off the parts much more rapidly after we shut the engine down, and doesn't provide as long-lasting lubrication, as long-lasting corrosion protection as monograde oil does, which is very, very thick and tends to cling for a much longer time. You can see that for yourself after shutdown. If you check how long it takes for the oil level to come up and stabilize on the dipstick after the engine is shut down, multigrade oil tends to stabilize within a couple of hours after shutdown. Monograde oil can take days before the oil level comes up and stabilizes after an engine shutdown, simply because the oil film is much gooier and thicker and takes a lot longer to strip off the parts. And we want it to stay on the parts to provide corrosion protection. In our piston aircraft engines, the #1 reason that our engines fail to make TBO is corrosion related. We almost never wear these engines out, as witnessed by the fact that both the engines on my airplane are at 200% of TBO. When we lose these engines early, it's almost always due to corrosion, and that's almost always in airplanes that are owner flown and that fly irregularly and have fairly long periods of disuse in between flights when corrosion can occur. So with all that as background, what we recommend to our managed maintenance clients is that we strongly prefer petroleum-based mineral oils over synthetic oils, at least as long as we continue to use leaded avgas as fuel, because the mineral oils keep the engine a lot cleaner, and the advantages of the synthetic oils are really not something we can take much advantage of, again, as long as we're using leaded avgas. Once we start running these engines on unleaded fuel, we may be able to take some more advantage of the synthetics and go to extended oil change intervals. But as long as we're using leaded avgas and we get the oil dirty as rapidly as we do, we really can't take advantage of the extended oil change intervals that synthetic oil could offer and does offer in automotive applications and turbine applications, simply because the oil just gets too dirty and we can't keep it in the engine any longer than about 50 hours. Also, we strongly prefer monogrades over multigrades for aircraft that aren't anticipated to be exposed to cold starts, to sub-freezing, unpreheated cold starts. For an airplane that's based in California like mine is, or in the southern part of the United States where it tends to never get terribly cold, there's no reason to be using multigrades. And the monograde has the advantage that it provides much better corrosion protection, which is one of the highest priorities in selection of oil. For airplanes that are based in cold weather areas, we recommend the use of multigrade oil during the cold season, when there is the likelihood of exposure to sub-freezing cold starts, but we recommend going to a monograde oil for the balance of the year. So commonly, the airplanes that we manage will use a multigrade for say 4 months out of the year, and use a single grade oil, monograde oil, for the remaining 8 months of the year when cold weather is not expected. We recommend Aeroshell W100, either plain with an aftermarket additive, we'll get into in a moment, or W100 Plus if aftermarket additives are not desired. For most of our clients, for clients that live in areas where sub-freezing starts are routine during the winter, we normally recommend the use of Phillips XC20W50 during the cold season. And the reason we prefer Phillips XC20W50 is it's the one multigrade oil that's made of all mineral stock and doesn't have any synthetic in it. Again, when we start running on unleaded fuel, we will probably take a very different view of synthetic oils, and it's very likely that a synthetic oil like Mobil Av 1 may very well come back on the market when that happens. But as long as we're using leaded fuel, we don't think that the synthetic oils do a good enough job of keeping the engine clean, and so we strongly prefer the use of mineral oils to keep the engine clean. Talk a little bit about additives. There are some additives that we actively recommend not using. Anything that has Teflon, PTFE, in it, it should not be used in an aircraft engine because it's potentially harmful. NASA did a study of Teflon-based additives and confirmed that Teflon-based additives have a phenomenon called I'm trying to think of what the name of it is. I'll think of it, but it's Teflon flocking, I guess is what it's called, where the small Teflon polymers will cluster together and create large enough particles that they can obstruct oil flow in small passages, like in hydraulic lifters and so on. The manufacturer of Teflon, DuPont, explicitly says that it should never be used in any kind of motor oil, and so we strongly advise against using any aftermarket additives containing Teflon or PTFE resin. There's a fairly popular aftermarket additive called AvBlend. When it was first introduced, we did a bunch of tests in some piston twins where one engine was treated with AvBlend, the other engine was not treated with AvBlend, and the engines were on a very rigorous oil analysis program, and we literally could not tell which engine was the treated engine. We saw no reduction in wear metals, and the primary claim to fame of AvBlend is it's supposed to inhibit wear. We just didn't see it in the tests. On the other hand, we've never seen any evidence that AvBlend does any harm to engines. So if using AvBlend gives you the warm and fuzzies, I won't discourage you from using it. But to be honest with you, we've never seen any concrete evidence that that it does reduce wear. There's an additive that I started testing in my own airplane about 4 years ago called ASL CamGuard that I am very impressed with. After I used it for about 3 years, I started recommending it to our managed maintenance clients, and we now have several hundred airplanes that are running with CamGuard as an additive. The major claim of fame to CamGuard is that it is a very, very effective corrosion inhibitor. It looks to me that it's considerably more effective than the corrosion inhibitor, for example, that Aeroshell blends into 15W50 and W100 Plus, or that Exxon blends into their Elite, which is virtually the same additive package as W100 Plus. I mean, excuse me, 15W50. So, for a lot of our managed maintenance clients, we recommend what I use in my own airplane, which is plain Aeroshell W100 Plus monograde with the addition of a pint of CamGuard at every oil change, for mainly for corrosion protection. It also, in my tests, showed a moderate reduction in wear metals in the oil analysis on the order of about 15%. Not super spectacular because, as I said, the lubrication demands of our piston aircraft engines are extremely modest. But the real big deal of why I like CamGuard is because it seems to do a superlative job of eliminating corrosion during periods of disuse, and that's the biggest killer of engines in the general aviation fleet is corrosion-related problems that take out our cams and that sort of thing. If you don't want to use something like CamGuard, then I recommend using an oil that has a corrosion inhibitor pre-blended in it, like Aeroshell W100 Plus or Exxon Elite. But the CamGuard seems to be more effective, at least in the testing that I've done. And so our number one preference is to use a mineral-based oil, typically either Aeroshell W100 monograde or Phillips 20W50 multigrade, with CamGuard added for corrosion reduction and anti-scuff. Talk a little about oil consumption. Everybody wants to know what normal oil consumption is, and there really is no normal because there are so many factors that affect oil consumption. Big bore engines like IO550s and stuff use a lot more oil than small bore engines like 320s and 360s. Six-cylinder engines naturally use more oil than four-cylinder engines. As a general rule, Continentals use more oil than Lycomings of the same displacement. And so there's a very, very wide range of acceptable oil consumption. Anything between a quart in 4 hours to a quart in 20 hours is a good number. If you use less than a quart in 20 hours, I worry about whether you're getting enough upper cylinder lubrication, because if we're getting enough lubrication at the upper part of our cylinder barrels, then a certain amount of oil consumption due to combustion gases is unavoidable. So we don't want no oil consumption. In fact, I remember early when the Continental powered Piper Malibu was introduced, it exhibited almost zero oil consumption. Everybody was very, very happy until the engines got to about 500 hours and suddenly started wearing out cylinders, and it turned out that there wasn't enough oil getting to the upper portion of the cylinder barrel, and so there was very accelerated wear. Continental wound up reducing the the tension on the oil control rings in order to get a little bit more oil on the cylinder walls. That caused oil consumption to go up somewhat, but drastically increased the longevity of the cylinders. Continental provides some. Lycoming does not really provide any guidance that I've ever found about how much oil consumption is too much. Continental provides guidance, two pieces of guidance. One, in one, they say that when oil consumption gets up to about 1/3 of a quart an hour, or a quart in 3 hours, it's a cause for concern and some troubleshooting should be done. If it gets up to a quart in 1 hour, they say the engine is unairworthy. I don't think any of us really would be very happy about operating a flat engine that used more than a quart an hour, if for no other reason, because it's very embarrassing to run out of oil before you run out of fuel. Radial engines obviously have much higher oil consumption because of the design of the engine, and they have much larger oil tanks, so we can burn a lot more oil in a radial engine before we have to worry about getting too low. We'll talk about how low is too low on oil level in a moment. As far as oil consumption is concerned, there were two other things that concern me other than oil consumption that's, say, more than 1/3 of a quart an hour. One is any sudden increase in oil consumption. If an engine has a history of burning a quart in 10 hours, for example, and all of a sudden it starts burning a quart in 5 hours. A quart in 5 hours is not excessive, but the fact that it suddenly changed from burning a quart in 10 to a quart in 5 means that something changed in the engine. And we don't know whether what changed is serious or not before we do some troubleshooting. So any sudden increase in oil consumption is certainly worth doing some detective work to try to find out why it's happening. And it may turn out that it's happening for a completely innocuous reason. All kinds of things can cause a sudden increase in oil consumption. A gasket on an oil filler cap that isn't sealing real well, so it's allowing pressurized air into the crankcase when we're flying the airplane, can increase crankcase pressure and shove a bunch of oil out the breather. A bad front crankshaft seal can do the same thing, and those are not serious problems, and we can certainly live with them until the next convenient maintenance interval when we can get it corrected. On the other hand, a sudden increase in oil consumption due to greatly increased blow-by can indicate something that's fairly serious, like a broken compression ring or something like that, or an overheated and annealed compression ring. So we want to do some investigation to figure out what is causing the increase in oil consumption, so that we can determine whether it's serious or not. Another thing that I like to keep track of is how quickly the oil turns dark and opaque after an oil change. You know, when we first change the oil is so light and transparent in color that sometimes it's a little hard to even get a dipstick reading, and the oil turns dark as it's in service because we're pumping all this filth into the oil. The rate at which it turns dark is very revealing of how much blow-by there is past the compression rings. And if oil turns dark and opaque very, very quickly, say within a few hours after an oil change, then that's a pretty good indication that we have excessive blow-by past the compression rings, and we probably want to do some stuff like compression tests and borescope inspections of the cylinders to figure out which cylinder or cylinders are the culprit and how serious the problem is. One other comment regarding oil consumption. A lot of owners who have high oil consumption we'll try to reduce the oil consumption by adding an aftermarket air-oil separator. We strongly recommend against doing that. It's not only a band-aid that is curing the symptom rather than curing the underlying problem, but there are a couple of very bad things about air-oil separators. One is that it's hiding a very important symptom. If an engine has a pressurized crankcase and therefore is losing a lot of oil out the breather, we want to know about that and fix it. And if you put an air-oil separator on the engine to make the symptom go away, then it can cover up a serious internal problem with the engine. We don't want to cover it up. We want to find it and fix it. But the other problem is that an air-oil separator is really not an air-oil separator. It's a liquid oil separator. It doesn't know the difference between oil and other liquids like water and acid and stuff. Copious quantities of which normally go out the breather, and putting an air oil separator on an engine makes it much harder for the engine to purge itself of moisture and acids, and so can do bad things for engine longevity. There are certain engines that have small air oil separators that were installed by the factory, and with those we don't have much choice because they're required for airworthiness. But we strongly discourage adding aftermarket air oil separators, particularly the big effective ones like the Airwolf, for example, because they do a very good job of minimizing apparent oil consumption or loss of oil, I guess you'd say, but at significant expense, and we just don't think it's a very good idea. Talk a little bit about oil level. Most engines, in my experience, don't like to be filled to the top of the dipstick, and if you do fill them to the top mark on the dipstick, they will often summarily throw a few quarts overboard until the oil level gets down to something more reasonable. There is no good reason for filling an engine to the top of the dipstick. It's important to understand that our engines require much less oil than that. As a matter of certification, any wet sump engine, which is most of our flat engines are wet sump engines, must be shown to operate normally during certification with the oil level at 1/2 of maximum capacity, which means if you have a 12-quart sump, the engine has to run just fine in all normal flight attitudes, nose up, nose down level, with 6 quarts or less in the sump. If you have an 8-quart sump, it has to, as a matter of certification, run fine on 4 quarts. And in fact, most of these engines will run on a lot less oil than that, quite happily, particularly Lycomings. Many Lycomings will maintain good oil pressure and good temperature with oil down as low as 3 quarts or less, even if they have a big 10 or 12 quart sump. So there's no particular reason or no particular advantage of filling these engines full of oil. And if you do fill them full of oil, they typically will chuck the first couple of quarts overboard. Some engines do that more than others. Attitude of the aircraft makes a big difference. A lot of engines will throw more oil overboard in a nose-up attitude than in a level or nose-down attitude, and so on. As a general rule, we recommend running engines at about 2/3 of the maximum level on the dipstick. So if it's an 8-quart, if the dipstick shows 8 quarts as the maximum capacity, something like 5 or 6 quarts is about right. That we manage about 7% of the Cirrus fleet, and those have 8-quart sump capacities, and we typically run them between 5 and 6 quarts, and add a quart when it gets down into the 4s. If you have 12 quart capacity, like in the engines on my 310, 8 quarts is about right, and that's typically where I run my engines, and I typically will add a quart of oil when it gets down to 7. If the engine has known high oil consumption and you want to give yourself a little more cushion, you can add an extra quart. 2/3 of max capacity plus 1 will work, but don't fill it up to the top. It doesn't help, and it just gives the engine an invitation to throw a bunch of oil overboard. On oil change intervals, once again, the oil change interval in piston aircraft engines is not dictated by how long the oil maintains its characteristics. It's dictated by the fact that our engines are exceptionally filthy and put an awful lot of garbage into the oil, much of which is too small to be filtered out by the oil filter and has to be retained as particulate matter, kept in suspension as particulate matter by the oil until you drain it out. We recommend never exceeding 50 hours of operation or 4 calendar months, whichever comes first. The reason for the 4 calendar months is that as oil gets more and more time on it, there tends to be more and more buildup of corrosive material, particularly acids in the oil. The oil has acid neutralizers to combat this. That's one of the additives that all aircraft operating oils have. But there's a finite quantity of the acid neutralizer, and if you allow too much acid buildup, the oil will start getting acidic and will start having a corrosive attack or a corrosive effect on expensive things like crankshafts and camshafts and stuff. So we don't want to see dirty oil sit in the engine for too long. So our recommendation is to change the oil at 50 hours or 4 calendar months, whichever comes first. If you fly a lot, the 50 hours will come first. If you fly obviously less than about 150 hours a year, then the 4 months will usually come first. In my case, the hours typically come first during the summer when I do a lot of flying and a lot of long trips, and the 4 months usually is determinative during the winter when I fly, when I tend to fly less. But that's our recommendation, and that's for engines with full flow spin-on oil filters. If you have an engine that only has a metal oil screen rather than a pleated disposable filter, then you shouldn't exceed 25 hours or 4 months, because the screen, it does not do nearly as good a job of filtering particulate material out of the oil, and therefore the oil has a much heavier load of particulates that it has to keep in suspension so that you don't wind up getting a bunch of sludge in the engine. If you do have an engine that only has an oil screen, we strongly recommend adding a full flow oil filter, both because it keeps the oil cleaner, and because when we cut the filter open to inspect it, a spin-on filter with the pleated media is a much better tool for finding metal particles than the metal screen, where it's much harder to see those particles. Also, retrofitting a spin-on oil filter will normally pay for itself very quickly, because it will double your oil change interval, particularly if you fly a lot. If metal is found in the oil filter, or the oil analysis looks worrisome, and we'll talk about those on the next slide, we would suggest reducing the oil change interval to something shorter until whatever it is that is making metal or putting high wear metals in your oil analysis has been identified, or resolves itself. Sometimes these problems are transient, sometimes they aren't, and they get worse over time. Either way, if the engine is making abnormal quantities of metal, it's a good idea to shorten the oil change interval until the source is found and the problem is corrected. And finally, try not to let the engine sit with dirty oil. If you come back from a trip and you know that the airplane isn't going to fly for 2 months because you're taking the family to Europe or something, it's a real good idea to change the oil after you get back, so that the engine sits during this period of disuse with clean oil in it rather than dirty, potentially corrosive oil. Oil filter inspection is probably the most important single means we have of determining the bottom-end health of the engine. I go into a lot of detail on this in a different webinar that is online in the EAA stack that deals with engine condition monitoring, but very briefly, excuse me, we're required to cut open the filter and inspect it for metal at every annual inspection. That's a regulatory requirement. But we should do this. We should change the filter and cut it open for inspection at every oil change, every 50 hours. A small quantity of metal in the filter is normal, particularly if the engine is low time or after some kind of engine work like a cylinder change or that sort of thing. How much metal is too much is a subject that, interestingly, Continental does not provide any guidance on, but Lycoming waxes poetic on it. They've got a number of service bulletins that go into great detail. And for lack of any guidance from Continental, we tend to use the Lycoming guidance even on Continental engines because it's better than nothing. And what Lycoming says, and it's very long-winded, I won't get into the details, but they basically say if the filter contains more than 1/8 of a teaspoon of metal, which is a lot of metal, then the engine should be troubleshot to determine the cause, where the metal's coming from. We'll talk a little bit about how we do that in a minute. And Lycoming recommends flying another 25 hours and then cutting open the new filter and re-inspecting for metal. If between 1/8 and 1/4 of a teaspoon is found, they recommend flying for another 10 hours and cutting open the filter. If more than 1/4 of a teaspoon of metal is found in the filter, they recommend grounding the aircraft until the source of the metal can be determined. 1/4 of a teaspoon of metal is a gigantic amount of metal. If you cut open the filter, saw 1/4 of a teaspoon of metal, you'd rise about 6 inches off the floor. That's a huge amount of metal. So basically the guidance is a little bit of metal, don't worry about it. A significant amount of metal, we need to worry about it. This is looking at an oil filter with a little bit of metal in it. It's pretty normal. We don't get heartburn over this. Here we're looking at a filter with a whole bunch of metal in it, and the metal is in the form of whiskers, which almost certainly means that a lifter is coming apart. You can just tell from the shape. And one of the first things we do when we see a significant amount of metal in a filter is we pull out a magnet to find out whether the metal is ferrous or non-ferrous metal. We tend to get a lot more worried about significant quantity of ferrous metal than we do about a significant quantity of non-ferrous metal. A lot of the time when we see non-ferrous metal in the filter, it's something fairly innocuous like piston plug scuffing that isn't really a significant airworthiness issue. So using a magnet to determine whether it's ferrous or non-ferrous is the way we typically handle that. Excuse me. This is a picture of a spalled lifter. It's a Continental lifter. And this is the sort of thing that would generally generate the kind of ferrous whiskers that we saw in the previous two slides. But it's not always quite so obvious where the metal is coming from. So if significant metal is found in the filter and it's not obvious where it's coming from, we will typically send out the filter media with the metal in it for scanning electron microscope analysis. And putting the contents of the filter under scanning electron microscope allows the lab to identify the exact quantity, shape, and type of the metal, typically the exact alloy of the metal, and normally we can figure out where the metal's coming from, whether it's a cam and lifter issue, whether it's a cylinder issue, whether it's bearing metal, whether it's a starter adapter, because all of those parts use metals of different alloys. Scanning electron microscope analysis is not nearly as scary as it sounds. Typically the cost of doing this is under $100, which is a whole lot cheaper than taking an engine apart to try to figure out what's wrong with it. So anytime we see a significant quantity of metal in the filter and it's not obvious where it's coming from, sending out the filter to a lab is for scanning electron microscope analysis is the logical next troubleshooting step. Both Continental and Lycoming have metallurgy labs, and they can inspect filter contents, but typically they will only do so if you bought the engine from them. In other words, if it's a factory new or factory rebuilt engine. If it's a field overhauled engine, they're not interested. We typically send our stuff to Aviation Laboratories in Kenner, Louisiana, www.avlab.com. It's an excellent lab. They typically get us a report back within 48 hours after they get the sample, and it's an extremely useful troubleshooting technique. Here's a report that came back from Aviation Laboratories, just so you can see the detail of the information that you get back. I'm also a big fan of spectrographic oil analysis. It's important to understand that spectrographic oil analysis is not a substitute for filter inspection. It's a complement to filter inspection because different kinds of abnormal wear events in the engine generate wear metal particles of different sizes. Rapid wear events tend to throw off large pieces of metal that will be caught by the filter and can be inspected visually and, if necessary, sent off to a lab for microscopic analysis. Slow wear events, where really hard surfaces are involved, tend to throw off microscopic particles that are too small to be caught in the filter and stay in suspension in the oil. And even if they got caught in the filter, they're too small to see with the naked eye, so we typically don't know that they're there. So the purpose of spectrographic oil analysis is to learn about wear metals that are so small that they're too small to see or it's too small to be caught by the filter. And we need to be aware of both large wear metal particles and small wear metal particles if we're going to be confident that we are doing a good job of condition monitoring and are aware of problems as they're developing. The spectrographic oil analysis is superb at detecting very slow wear events, such as, for example, as accelerated valve guide wear that will eventually lead to a burned exhaust valve. But long before it leads to a burned exhaust valve, often a year or two before, we will start noticing a gradually increasing level of nickel in the oil analysis reports, because the exhaust valve guides are made of a high nickel, high temperature steel alloy, and so when they start to wear at an abnormal rate, we will see an abnormal rise in nickel in the oil analysis, and we'll get a real early heads up that there's likely an exhaust valve problem developing. So we'll start to use other tools like compression checks and the bore scope inspections to identify which cylinder is having the problem and make sure that we catch the problem before it fails in flight. We send all of our oil analysis work to Blackstone Laboratories in Fort Wayne, Indiana, blackstone-labs.com. We think they're the best oil analysis lab in the business. Aviation Laboratories that I mentioned on the previous slide is also a good lab, but we like Blackstone better for the analysis of the liquid oil. So that's who we use for all of our oil analysis work. Here's an example of a couple of Blackstone reports that came back on my airplane a while back, back in the middle of 2010. Since I have a twin-engine airplane, I get 2 reports each time. And by the way, I send out a sample at every oil change, every 50 hours or less, at the same frequency that I cut open the filters. And if we look a little bit closer at the report, this is for the left engine, you can see the format of the report. There is the current sample. It's in the left-hand column that has a red box around it. And then there are the 5 previous samples so that we can analyze trends. Then there are 2 grade columns, one called unit averages, which is a kind of a weighted average for this particular engine. And there's a gray column at the extreme right called universal averages, which is a weighted average not of this particular engine, but of all of the engines that of this kind, in this case TSIO 520BB engines, that Blackstone follows. And so those 2 grayed out columns give us some basis for comparison. And if you look at this particular report, you will see that this engine has historically made about 16 parts per million of nickel, which is about normal for this kind of engine. The universal average is 14 parts per million, which is statistically identical. But that over the last couple of years, there's been a trend of rising nickel in this engine, and in the May report, that nickel was up to 35 parts per million. That indicated that there was an exhaust valve problem developing, and that nickel continued to escalate until about a year later, in May of 2011, when I pulled the number 4 jug off this engine and had it revalved. But you can see that this thing was giving me some advanced warning a couple of years in advance that something was happening on this engine. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't tell you what cylinder is involved, so you have to use other techniques like specifically bore scope inspection to determine which cylinder is the culprit, but it gives you a very early heads up. So that's all I have, and Hal, this would be a good time to start the Q&A. I will leave this slide up on the screen while we do that, so everybody has my email address and my website address and so on. And by the way, if you have any questions that don't get answered during this session tonight, or there are any questions that come up in the future, please feel free to email me, because I'm always happy to try to help out on maintenance issues, and I'm a very good email correspondent. I typically get back to you right away. So with that, Hal, why don't I turn the audio over to you?
Okay, Mike, that sounds great. That's an amazing presentation. I'm always fascinated and a little humbled by the depth of your knowledge when you go through these. So we've got a lot of good questions that have come in, and now I will say, Mike in particular, that I'm going to err on the side of making sure we get as many of these answered as we can, even though it may be without without your technical expertise, I may not recognize that some of them have been answered. So I do apologize if we cover some redundant territory, but I do want to make sure we get.
Not a problem. As I say, if we run out of time, any questions that I haven't answered, I encourage participants to drop me an email and be happy to answer them that way.
Great. Well, let's just dive in here, and I'll start picking some of these right off the list. Here's one. Mike Pastore had a specific question about CamGuard, and just wondering what overall your quick thoughts on using CamGuard with Aeroshell 1550. And in the previous question, he mentions that he's got a C85. Let's see. He was one with the Pete and Paul. Nope, I misread it. So he's got a C85.
Okay, well, it's kind of a loaded question because the first thing I'm compelled to say is that for the reasons that I talked about, Aeroshell 15W50 is my absolute least favorite oil, and it's the one oil that's on the market right now that I actively encourage my managed maintenance clients not to use. But if you're using 15W50, it already has corrosion inhibitors and anti-scuff blended in, and so I wouldn't particularly recommend adding CamGuard to that. It's somewhat redundant. CamGuard's fairly expensive stuff. Aeroshell 15W50 is extremely expensive stuff. Again, what we would recommend to our clients is to use Phillips 20W50, which is a kind of a simple plain Jane multigrade with that's all made of petroleum with no synthetics in it, or Aeroshell W100, which is a plain grade petroleum-based single weight oil, and add the CamGuard. But if you're buying a high-priced oil like 15W50 or Exxon Elite that already has corrosion inhibitors and anti-scuff blended in, there's no real point in adding the CamGuard. I think the CamGuard's a little bit more effective, but we don't really need to give the engine a double or triple dose of additives. So if you want to keep using the 15W50, I would probably suggest not spending the money to put the CamGuard in.
Okay, well, great. And moving down the list, here's where I saw the Pete and Paul. This is Chuck Ganser. He's got a Continental A65. And he said in his Pete and Paul, the engine rarely runs over 140 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Wonders, should he be concerned about this? And the mentions he uses Aeroshell 100. And what could he do to get the temp up a little higher? He's considering insulating the oil tank.
Well, that is a great question, and I'm glad he asked it, because I neglected to talk about oil temperature in the prepared presentation. The ideal oil temperature that we like to see is around 180 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. If possible, we like to see we really want to see oil at stable operating, stable cruise and that sort of thing, at or above 170 degrees. And the reason for that is a little inobvious, but in almost all aircraft engines, and I'll say almost all because I haven't looked at every aircraft engine, but in almost all aircraft engines, the oil temperature sensor is situated at the coldest part of the oil cycle, typically right after the oil cooler. And I'm not even sure if an A65 actually has an oil cooler, or if it simply depends on its tank for the cooling. But at any rate, when the temperature that we see on the oil temperature gauge is typically the coldest the oil is as it goes through its cycle. And as it proceeds through the engine and absorbs heat from a lot of hot stuff, since one of its major functions of oil is as a coolant, the temperature typically rises on the order of 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And then it goes through an oil cooler or maybe back in the oil tank if it's an A65. to cool down before it starts the cycle again. So if we're seeing 170 degrees on the gauge, then in all likelihood the oil is getting up to somewhere around 210 degrees or so at its hottest point. And we want that hottest point to be at or above the boiling point of water, so that moisture in the oil will vaporize and get blown out the breather. It's important to understand that one of the major byproducts of the combustion of gasoline and air is copious quantities of water, and a lot of that water goes out the exhaust, but a fair amount of that water gets blows past the compression rings and winds up in the oil. And the engine needs to purge itself of that water continuously, and the only way it does that is if the oil gets up to at least the boiling point of water. Now, the higher the airplane flies, the lower the boiling point of water. So 150 or say degrees on the oil temperature gauge might be okay if you're flying the airplane up around 10,000 feet, where the water boils at a lower temperature. But if you fly mostly at low altitudes, we really need to try to get the oil temperature up. Again, if memory serves, I don't think an A65 has an oil cooler, so probably insulating the oil tank would be the next best step to get the oil temperature up.
Okay, great. I'm going to just go out on a limb and assume that Chuck doesn't fly his Pete and pole up above 10,000 feet all that often.
Yeah, probably. Yes.
Probably not. Okay, here's another specific question. This is Brian Von Bevern. He notes he usually uses is it Phillips XC20W50, and he has a mechanic who recommends using a Lycoming additive, LW16702, and wonders if you have any input on that. Right.
Lycoming 16702 is an anti-scuff additive, or what we call an extreme pressure additive called triphenyl phosphate. It is actually the very same additive that Shell blends into 15W50 and Aeroshell W100 Plus, and the same additive that Exxon Elite blends into. Exxon blends into its Elite 20W50. Triphenyl phosphate is a good extreme pressure additive. It's there primarily to enhance the life of cam lobes and lifter faces, and particularly those are particularly a problem in Lycomings, because Lycomings, unlike Continentals, Lycomings have a cam that's high up in the crankcase above the where the crankshaft is. So when you start a Lycoming, oil extruding out the crankshaft bearings drop down due to gravity, don't get up to the camshaft until the engine is making pretty good RPMs, in which case then it starts filling the crankcase with a dense oil mist. Continental engines, in contrast, have a crankshaft that's down near the bottom of the crankcase, below the crankshaft, and so even when oil starts extruding out of the bearings, even at very low RPMs, sometimes even when you're just cranking the engine, that oil is going to fall on the camshaft. But Lycomings have a lot more lubrication failure problems with their crankcase. With their cams and lifters, particularly during that early period right after engine start. So anything we can do to improve the boundary lubrication is a good thing. And the Lycoming additive is a good thing to add if you're using the Phillips 20W50 oil, which does not have anti-scuff additive pre-blended in it. I think CamGuard is actually better, and CamGuard provides a very effective corrosion inhibitor, which the Lycoming additive doesn't do. Lycoming additive is strictly an extreme pressure or anti-scuff additive, whereas the CamGuard contains both anti-scuff and a very, very effective corrosion inhibitor. So my recommendation is, if you're using Philips 20W50, you definitely want to add an additive to it. I think the CamGuard is a much better additive to add to it than the Lycoming additive. But if you don't want to add CamGuard, adding the Lycoming additive is a whole lot better than not.
Okay, that's great. Looking through the list here, I do see that two people, Shane Wallace and Detlef, and I apologize, Detlef, I believe the last name is pronounced Hoyne or Hoon. Both of these folks have asked general questions. What do you think about Marvel Mystery Oil?
Marvel Mystery Oil. Marvel Mystery Oil has been used in piston aircraft engines for a lot longer than the 4 decades that I've been an aircraft owner. The first thing I'll say is there's no indication it does any harm. Marvel Mystery Oil is no longer a mystery, because in the current world, the manufacturer of Marvel Mystery Oil, which happens to be turtle wax, by the way, is required by federal regulation to publish the ingredients in an MSDS sheet, which you can find on the internet. And if you look at what is in Marvel Mystery Oil, you'll find some very, very fascinating ingredients, including pig fat and a bunch of perfume and some red food coloring, but discounting the stuff that's there just for cosmetics. Basically, what Marvel Mystery Oil is a solvent. It's not approved. On the other hand, nobody has ever been busted for putting it in an aircraft engine, and as far as I can tell, it's never harmed an aircraft engine. It has shown some effectiveness in freeing stuck hydraulic valve lifters. So I would recommend considering adding some Marvel Mystery Oil to the oil, not to the fuel, please. If you think you're hearing some lifter clatter in your engine. I have even been known to do that myself. I would not particularly recommend it as a standard operating additive. In the absence of lifter clatter, I wouldn't particularly add it, not because it does any harm, but because it's just not going to do any good. But that's its primary benefit is as a solvent to free up sticky lifters. And as far as I'm concerned, it's okay to use on that basis, even though it's not specifically approved for aircraft engine use. But it's not going to hurt anything.
And I can honestly say, of all the ingredients that make up the mystery part of the mystery oil, I would not have guessed pig fat to be on the list.
No, maybe, I don't think anybody would have guessed it. But you have to remember that this stuff was originally developed in the 20s.
Right.
By the way, by the same Marvel guy that invented the Marvel carburetor.
Oh, well, that's interesting. That's well. I'm getting myself distracted.
Ask me why I'm tying up neurons remembering stuff like that, which has no possible benefit to anybody, except it just happens to be interesting.
Ask me why I'm wasting everybody's time making comments about pig fat, and I'll just apologize to everybody and try to get to another question here, Mike. Let's see, as I was moving along here. Okay, here's one from Chris Treadwell, a pretty specific question. It says, quote, our particular area of interest is a Rotax 912 and Jabiru 6-cylinder, both use MoGas. You have a general oil recommendation for those?
Well, it's very important for a man to know his limitations, and to be honest with you, 100% of my experience is with certificated engines, so I really don't know anything about either of those two engines. What I can say is that if the engine is being operated on unleaded autogas, then there might be some benefit in operating it on a synthetic oil or a semi-synthetic oil. Something that I don't like to do on certificated engines that are running on unleaded fuel. I think I better keep it at that because I just don't have specific knowledge of the Rotax or the Jabiru engines.
Okay, fair enough. And I'll just scrolled off here. Okay, Stephen Floyd has an 0540, and he's asking, he mentions one of the oil manufacturers has a storage oil, and says if his airplane's going to be inactive for 6 months, would it be better to use a quote storage oil than the W100?
That's a terrific question. The answer is absolutely yes. If you know that the airplane is going to be inactive for more than about 60 days, it's a very, very good idea to preserve it, or colloquially what we call pickle it. Both Lycoming and Continental have service bulletins that describe the pickling procedure, and the recommendations of both Lycoming and Continental are almost identical. But a full pickling and for a 6-month downtime, unless you live in a very low corrosion area, like Tucson or something. If you live in a high or moderate corrosion risk area, I would definitely pickle the engine, put it in what's called flyable storage. And basically the way you do that is you do an oil change, you fill the sump with a special preservative oil. There are 2 commercially available preservative oils, one from Phillips, which is called 2050 anti-rust oil, and another one from Shell, which has the interesting name of Aeroshell Fluid 2F. Those are both specifically pickling oils. Also, you put you do an oil change, fill a sump with one of those oils. Preferably go fly the airplane for 10 or 15 minutes to get the oil very well distributed. If you can't do that, just give it a really, really thorough run up on the ground. You have a controllable pitch prop, cycle the prop a bunch of times to get the preservative oil into the prop dome. Then after you shut down, you remove the top spark plugs from each cylinder, and you insert desiccant plugs, little plastic plugs that have desiccant crystals in them, which you can pick up at aircraft spruce very inexpensively. You put a couple of cloth bags of desiccant crystals, one in the exhaust and one in the induction intake. Duct tape them over, and you're done. An engine that has been preserved in that fashion can go a couple of years without having any corrosion problems. When it's time to put the airplane back in service, you obviously replace the desiccant plugs with real spark plugs, pull the desiccant bags out of the intake and exhaust. You're actually allowed to fly with the preservative oil for up to 25 hours before changing it out. I wouldn't particularly recommend it because the preservative oil has no ashless dispersants, so I would want to warm it up, get rid of it, put the normal operating oil in, and then go fly. But it's a very, very good idea to do that.
Okay, well, I think that overlaps actually rather well with Pascal Reed's question. I think maybe you've hit it, but maybe just to go a little bit deeper into that first start. He's got a 540 as well, and let's see, it's an IO 540 D4A5, just got overhauled, and just wondering about your suggestions for pre-oiling the engine for that first start after the overhaul.
Well, when the engine is built up, it's built up with a build-up lube, typically some kind of molybdenum grease and stuff. And so if it hasn't been sitting around for an excessively long time since the overhaul, you probably don't need to do anything special with regard to pre-lubing it. The exception to that is if it's a turbocharged engine. If it's a turbocharged engine, you definitely want to pre-lube the turbocharger bearings. If the engine's been sitting around for a long time, it probably wouldn't hurt to remove the top spark plugs, atomize some light spray oil into the cylinders, ACF 50, Corrosion X, LPS 2, anything like that you can spray in there. And then with the while the spark plugs are still removed, motor the engine with the starter until you see some oil pressure registering on the oil pressure gauge, and that may take several minutes. You don't want to do that with the top spark plugs in, because with a compression load, you don't want to run a starter for more than about 30 seconds without giving it a few minutes rest. But with the top with the top spark plugs out, so that there's no compression load, the engine turns over very easily, and it's okay to crank it with the starter for a few minutes until you see oil pressure come up on the gauge. At that point, you've done pretty much all you can. Put the top spark plugs in and start it and go fly.
Sounds good. Okay, I'm just keeping one eye on the clock here. We're starting to come up against it, but I've got a couple more I'd like to squeeze in. But I do want to encourage...
I tend to keep an eye on the number of attendees, and when it starts to plummet, it's usually time to go home.
No,
we still have 180 people in the room. I think
a lot of people in the room. Yep,
was in the low 200s someplace. So we've got a few people who are hanging on till the last dog dies.
Absolutely, and but I do hope that anyone whose questions that we just aren't going to be able to get to do follow up with you in email, Mike, because that's great to make that address available, and it's still up there on the screen as I see. Okay, so here's one from Scott Saddam. Again, hoping I'm not butchering the last name too badly. And his question just starts with one word: preheat! Exclamation point, and then says, at what temperature, quote, should you, and at what temperature is it mandatory?
Well, it's a good question, Scott. Let me start off by saying preheating is super important if you operate in cold weather. A single unpreheated cold start at, say, 20 F or less outside air temperature will do more, will generate more physical wear on the engine components than 500 hours of normal operation. It's a major sin to start an engine cold without preheat. How cold is too cold, obviously, is a trick question, because there aren't any magic numbers in this business. But since everybody always wants a number, I would generally say that starting an engine cold soaked to a temperature below freezing is a crime. And if the temperature is below 20 F, it's a felony. Is that good enough?
that sounds good. It's one's a crime, the other's a felony. And you said 500 hours. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, and that again, because our engines virtually do not wear, with very few exceptions. The amount of wear is almost zero during steady state cruise operation. The largest increment of physical wear to our engines occurs when we first start them, and during the first, say, 20-30 seconds after the engine starts. The longer the engine has been sitting before we do that start, and effectively the drier it is in terms of lubrication, the more significance that increment of wear. And there are other things that affect it, like what additives we have and that sort of thing. But so the operation of the engine, once has been started, comes up to RPM, and there's lots of splash oil in the crankcase, is almost zero. I mean, it's very, very low. There are a few areas that wear during normal operation. For example, valve guides, simply because they don't really have any hydrodynamic lubrication. There is a little bit of wear up at the ring step area, but not very much. And there's a little bit of wear on cams and lifters, but definitely not very much. If we could somehow manage to not have to start and stop these engines, they would last darn near forever. And if you look at engines that do run without starting and stopping, like piston engines that operate in oil fields and stuff like that, where they just run 24/7 all the time, they last damn near forever. It's really the starting and the stopping and the heating and the cooling that we have to do with our aircraft engines that is what causes them to wear. But a single cold start, unpreheated cold start, is a very, very severe event as far as wear is concerned.
That's remarkable. That's given me a lot to think about, certainly.
By the way, a good friend of mine, John Frank, who is the executive director of Cessna Pilots Association, has a metaphor that I kind of like. He says, basically, every time I turn the key on my Cessna T210, I visualize that I take a fresh $50 bill out of my wallet and throw it out the window. And I guess on my twin, I have to throw a $50 bill out each side.
Right. You need somebody in the right seat.
That's actually a pretty good visual image. That every time you start an engine, you incur a significant increment of wear, and the longer the engine is sat before you start it, the worse that is, and the colder it is out, if it's down below freezing, the worse that wear is by quite a lot.
Okay, and I'm going to just pluck another one off the list here, just because it sounds fairly focused and specific.
And these are great questions, by the way.
There's definitely some great ones in here, and I again apologize to those that I'm having to sort of skim over. Either I'm looking like we've covered them, or I'm just at least trying to give us a little bit of a variety. But Mike, I think I'm going to have you close with this one, if that works for you.
Sure.
And that is this is Andrew Clark, and I'm going to just broadcast my ignorance because I can't even tell you if this was a typo or if this is just something that I haven't heard of. But his question, quote, do you have any experience with the NEY or NEY nozzle STC for Lycomings to increase cam lobe lubrication? And he says,
yes. Yes, and it's a very good idea. As I mentioned before, and I won't elaborate on it now, but Lycomings are uniquely lubrication challenged when it comes to the cam and lifters, because the cam and lifters on Lycoming are mounted up high, and so they don't get lubricated real early in the start cycle. And after you shut a Lycoming down, the cam and lifters are the first things that are going to lose their protective oil film. Whereas in a Continental, you've got this monstrous crankshaft all covered with oil, and for literally days and days and days, that oil will drip off the crank and land on the cam. But in Lycoming, nothing lands on the cam because it's up high at the very top of the engine. The NEY nozzle is a modification that is done when the engine is torn down, typically at overhaul time, that inserts some little nozzles in the main oil gallery that are aimed at the camshaft, so that as soon as there is oil pressure in the main galley, these nozzles squirt oil directly on the camshaft and provide additional lubrication. It's not a panacea. It doesn't solve the very initial dry start problem, but the more oil we can get on the cam and lifters in a Lycoming, the better. So it's a useful mod, and you can't really do it without tearing the engine down. So it's the kind of thing that you would do at overhaul time. But it's definitely worth doing. It doesn't cost very much, and it's an excellent idea.
Okay, well that's great. Well, like I said, I think we're going to wrap it on that. We're just hitting the 2-hour mark, and this has been another great, in-depth, and fantastic presentation, Mike. We certainly appreciate you taking the time to share it with us and share it with our audience. Our thanks go out again, of course, to Aircraft Spruce for their generous sponsorship of this, and of course, big thanks to everyone who came out and attended tonight.
Okay, and just as a little plug, since there are still about 140 people in the room, the next in this webinar series is the 5th of October, and it's a webinar called All About Cylinders, and it's really an interesting one. So those of you who are interested, please mark your calendars for October 5th. It's going to be an excellent a webinar. I think you'll find quite interesting.
And any of those folks that are out there, oh, excuse me, one last comment. Bill Ross says, "I'll be there, sir." So so you've got at least one signed up already, and I know for a fact there's a few hundred more.
Which Bill Ross is that? Is that Bill Ross from Continental? What's his email address?
Yeah, Jeffrey Herman says he's already signed up.
Okay.
So next time I host one with you, Mike, I'm going to carve out the end for your fan club to chime in. That's great. That you deserve the accolades there. So okay, well, again, with that, we are up against the clock. So I encourage everyone else with their questions that went unanswered to follow up with you directly, Mike. Thanks again to you, my friend.
Oh, my pleasure. I love to do these things. Look forward to doing it again next month.
That sounds great. And thanks again to everyone who came out tonight. And with that, good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.